Good morning, and welcome to our first ever virtual capstone presentation series. These seniors have worked exceptionally hard all year to research their topics in order to produce a sizable written project as well as this presentation. As a reminder, the presenter can't see your comments in the chat in real time, but I can. So at any point during the presentation, you can post questions or comments. At the end of the presentation, I will ask for questions to be submitted in the chat, and I'll pick some of those out to ask our presenter. Uh, our presenter this time, Olivia Knoop, joked throughout this year that we needn't worry about her motivations for her topic, which examines the motivations and histories of famous psychopaths. Of course, we are in an age when our entertainment industry is promoting a number of television shows and movies that explore psychopathy. Shows like Dexter and Mindhunter examine this phenomenon explicitly, while a number of recent movies played to the public interests in the concept, from Split to Joker. Olivia chose to focus on the true and often uncomfortable stories of psychopaths in order to better understand how they think, how they present, and how we can help them. Olivia, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
I'm great. Are you ready to present?
Yeah.
All right. So without further ado, here's Olivia Knoop with her journey into the minds of psychopaths.
Today we will be looking into the minds and lives of a psychopath. When I first started researching this topic, I had a very vague idea what my research was all about. I learned, as you will learn today, that psychopaths are much more complex than we believe. We will not only look into the mind of a psychopath, but what makes a psychopath, the different types of psychopaths, possible therapies, infamous examples, and finally, the role that the media plays in all of this. But let's start small. What is a psychopath? A psychopath is defined as a person suffering from a chronic mental disorder with an abnormal or violent social behavior. This is important to understand that this is a very general definition. Another important aspect of psychopaths is successful and unsuccessful. A successful psychopath is someone who has committed a crime, usually murder, and gotten away with it. An unsuccessful psychopath has committed a crime and has been caught or incarcerated. Now that we know this, let's backtrack a bit. What makes a psychopath? The brain deficiencies of a psychopath originate in the temporal lobe, which is located in the bottom back of the brain. The temporal lobe is located within this lobe is the amygdala, which regulates emotions such as anger, fear, sadness, and aggression. Also located within the temporal lobe is the hippocampus and the corpus callosum, which also regulate emotion. The brain deficiencies of a psychopath can cause them to seem shallow or lacking remorse. Besides brain chemistry, psychopaths are affected by the environment in which they are raised in. The environment that a child is raised in plays a pivotal role in who they become as an adult. A study done by Howell, Carter, Miller-Graff, Schwartz, and Grant Berman in 2017 showed that children who were physically abused or neglected were more likely to exhibit criminal behavior as an adult. They did this by giving out 19 tests about childhood, substance use, and criminal history. Another important study done by Dr. John Bowlby explores a child's relationship with their primary parent. This is called the attachment theory. A primary parent is the adult who plays the biggest role in raising a child. In Bowlby's study, the primary parent and the child were introduced to new toys and eventually a stranger. After some time, the mother left the child with the toys and the stranger. Based on how the children reacted to their parents leaving, they were separated into 3 groups. The first group was children who were considered secure. Children who were secure were obviously distressed when their parents left, but were able to interact with the stranger and play with the toys, and immediately reconnected with their mother when she came back. Children who were considered avoidant were distressed and made a small effort to connect with the stranger and the toys, and it took them some time to reconnect with their mother when she came back. The final group is resistant. Children who are considered resistant were so distressed when their parents left that they were unable to connect with the toys, the stranger, and made no effort to connect with their parent when she got back. Children who react like this are similar to psychopaths because psychopaths often feel insecure in their relationship with their primary parent. An example of a psychopath who fits into the resistant category is Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos is a serial killer from Florida who was abandoned by her mother twice. For a period of time, she believed her mother was her sister because she was raised by her grandparents. She was constantly abused by her grandfather and later became a prostitute, which is how she lured in her victims. When categorizing psychopaths, Wuornos would fall into the same category as Bundy. Both are considered histrionic psychopaths. Histrionic psychopaths have 5 distinct qualities: a need for attention, they're sexually driven, they have an exaggerated personality, they have rapid shifts in emotion, and they are obsessed with their looks. This is almost completely opposite with schizopath. This is David Berkowitz, who I'll talk about later. Now, it's important to realize that not all people with schizophrenia are psychotic or violent. The effects of schizophrenia can be heightened by things such as drugs, alcohol, or trauma. The effects of schizophrenia include hallucinations, which is seeing something that's not there, and delusions, which is believing something that is not true. Paranoid psychopaths, like schizophrenic psychopaths, experience delusions. This is Ed Gein, and he's one of the most well-known paranoid psychopaths. A paranoid psychopath is a type of psychopath who believes that everyone is against them. They often have a hard time understanding humor and hold grudges that can become violent. They're also known to have a strong attachment to a person, place, or thing. Ed Gein is a serial killer from Wisconsin. He's best known for making household items out of his victims' bodies. He had an unhealthy attachment with his mother, who was his primary parent, and is known to have kept her rooms museum style after she passed away. He is also accused of killing his brother because his brother felt that they had an unhealthy relation. Ed Gein and his mother had an unhealthy relationship. One of the most surprising types of psychopath is a corporate psychopath. Corporate psychopaths are typically nonviolent, they have a drive for achievement, and have no problem stabbing someone in the back or firing someone to get ahead. Corporate psychopaths are most often found in the finance industry because of the way the 2008 recession shook up the industry. It's much easier now to get ahead. An example of a psychopath in the finance industry is Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff was born in Queens and began Bernie L. Madoff Investment Securities with his wife and specialized in selling penny stocks, which is never a good sign. Madoff cultivated personal relationships with his clients and financial regulators who would check in on his business annually. This shows that he knew what he was doing wrong. Madoff promised a 10% return on all investments and scammed anywhere from $50 to $65 billion from his clients. His drive for achievement and ability to manipulate are all signs of a psychopath. Another example is his apology, in which he says he can live with his client's anger towards him and is only really upset by the fact that his family is disappointed in him. Can someone be cured of being a psychopath? The short answer is no. There have been many studies that have tried, including a failed study at the Oak Ridge facility in Pentanguishene, Ontario. In the 1970s, they gave patients LSD and other psychopharmaceuticals as a form of therapy. David Johannessy, a patient at the hospital for 34 years, experienced these therapies firsthand. One disturbing therapy that he described was the capsule program, in which 7 patients were placed in a small, windowless room that was continuously lit for days on end, and they would only receive food through a straw. Clearly, abuse didn't work. Psychopaths do not react to punishments, and the Mendota facility in Wisconsin is using rewards to rehabilitate their patients. Patients can join special clubs and get special privileges based on the amount of points that they get. At Mendota, they want the boys to realize that it's more gratifying to do good than to do wrong. The founders of Mendota have tracked 248 men considered delinquents. 101 of them have been treated at Mendota. They found that 64%. They found that boys treated at Mendota had a 64% chance of being reincarcerated, while those who weren't had a 97% chance. They also found that 36% of the boys treated at Mendota had a chance of committing a violent crime, compared to those who weren't, who had a 60% chance. So can a psychopath be cured? No. But with continued therapy and the proper skills, they may be able to stay out of trouble when it comes to violent crimes. Now that we know what makes a psychopath, let's take a look at some infamous examples. First is Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, to his mother, Eleanor Cowell. He was an illegitimate child and didn't know this until he was 13 years old. This made him feel insecure in his relationship with his mother, who was his primary parent. This traumatic event caused his psychopathic tendencies to surface, and Bundy began killing at 27 years old. He began by attacking Joni Lenz in her apartment, but he did not kill her. The first person he abducted was Linda Ann Healy. He then lay dormant for 2 months. He most likely lay dormant because he was content with his first kill. Over the next 5 months, Bundy killed 1 woman every month. In 1974 alone, he killed 12 women, and failed to abduct 1. His victim type, as seen here, was usually white women in their mid-20s with dark hair. One outlier is one of his final victims, Kimberly Ann Leach, who was just 12 years old. Bundy was put to death in Florida in 1989. Next is David Berkowitz, also known as the son of Sam, who I mentioned before. David Berkowitz was born on June 1, 1953 in the Bronx. He was adopted and grew up with his adoptive parents, and he was considered very intelligent as a child, scoring 118 out of 144 on an IQ test when he was only in the 1st grade. When Berkowitz was 7, he found out that he was adopted. At the same time, he was being severely bullied at school. This trauma affected his schizophrenia in the future. An example is when he was 11, he began to hear monsters. When serving in the Korean War, Berkowitz began experimenting with drugs. When he arrived home, he began to set fires around the Bronx, and set 1,488 fires leading up to 1975. In 1975, Berkowitz began hearing voices in his head. This led him to stab 2 young women. Both survived. The voices in his head became so extreme that he moved apartments to get away from the howling demons. In July of 1976, he killed 2 passengers in a car. 4 months later, he shot into another car but failed to kill either passenger. A month later, he paralyzed Joanne Lamino and failed to kill the other passenger in her car. During 1977, he killed 6 people and attempted to kill 2 others. He was known for his random killings, which were considered quick and efficient. Berkowitz was sentenced to 365 years in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21, 1960, and was considered a very bubbly child. One thing that childhood friends found odd was his fascination with the inner workings of animals. When his parents also divorced when he was very young, which caused him to become unmotivated. Dahmer killed his first victim when he was just 18. He picked up his victim, who was hitchhiking, and took him out for drinks. Dahmer waited another 10 years before he killed his next victim. He usually killed men or teenagers, but as you can see here, a majority of his victims were African American. Dahmer was only arrested after one of his victims escaped and alerted the police. Dahmer was sentenced to 941 years in prison, but died after being assaulted by another inmate. Now, some of you may have heard of these serial killers fairly recently. Over 20 years after Dahmer's death, My Friend Dahmer was released, starring someone who we might know from Disney, Ross Lynch. A critic said, Myers humanizes him without minimizing his monstrousness or his mystery. The scariest thing of all, his mundanity. Movies like this have also come out about other serial killers. Most recently, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile came out about Ted Bundy. This movie starred Zac Efron from High School Musical. When this movie came out, Twitter was divided over Efron's looks. Many were unable to separate his looks from who he was playing. A critic said, Zac Efron might be the best thing about Joe Berlinger's strange biopic of the serial killer Ted Bundy, which is a sentence I never imagined myself writing. The traditional idea of a crazy killer has been traded in for clean-cut glamour. Directors and producers are now introducing serial killers to a whole new generation as heartthrobs. It doesn't matter if you portray them as damaged souls or psychopaths, you're still adding to the legend. Why is this an issue? When serial killers are introduced to the public and elevated to a level of stardom and notoriety of national news, they begin to get an inflated ego. For example, when a serial killer is given a nickname, they feel that they have to live up to that name. These are just some nicknames given to serial killers by the media. They often use these names to taunt them. Now let's take a look at ourselves. Why are we so fascinated with psychopaths? We're all guilty of being fascinated with psychopaths. I wrote a whole paper about them, and you're watching a presentation about them. Usually it's because we want to know what makes them so fundamentally different than the rest of us. But most of the time, these differences just create stereotypes. One stereotype that has been heavily perpetuated by the media is the McDonald's triad. The McDonald's triad has been around for over 51 years, and it states that a child who is cruel to animals, wets the bed, and sets fires will become a psychopath. People most likely accept this theory because they find comfort in the fact that psychopaths can be distinctly different than the rest of the general public at a young age. What these people need to understand is that psychopaths can't be fully diagnosed until they're 18 years old. And even then, it's often difficult to see signs. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer was considered a bubbly child. What I've learned is that even if a psychopath does fit into the triad, it is usually because of childhood abuse or trauma that they have experienced. I hope that you have learned today that psychopaths are not just one-dimensional characters, but complex people who need to be studied and correctly treated. When deciding how to end my presentation, I looked to one of my favorite shows, Criminal Minds. They read a quote that sums up what they have just experienced, and I have chosen this quote for my presentation. Out of suffering emerge the strongest souls, the most massive characters are seared with scars. Khalil Gibran. Thank you.
All right, well done, Olivia. I am going to say if anybody has any questions, you can post them in the chat now. But the first one I wanted to ask was, you already talked about this a little bit in your introduction, but what is it that drew you to this topic? I mean, you talked a little bit about that as in your almost in your conclusion there about how media is portraying it, and we're all sort of interested in it. But what is it that drew you specifically to this project?
When I was in 8th grade, I read a book about psychopaths and the neuroscience behind them, and I've been fascinated ever since. And throughout high school, I haven't really gotten the opportunity to study them in the way I like. So when the opportunity to take Capstone arose, I figured, why not research something that has interested me so much for such a long time?
Okay. There's a question here. Why are women less likely to be psychopaths? Did that come into your research at all?
A little bit. Women are less likely to be psychopaths. There are female psychopaths, but they're just not researched or shown as much. That's something I found in the media section of my paper. Women like Eileen Wuornos often use cleaner types of eliminating their victims, so we don't hear about them as much, but there are female psychopaths.
Okay. a question from Miss Curry here. Let me pull that up. Here we go. She says, "Great job, but a little disturbing. I don't know if you looked into this or not, but would you be able to tell us the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? Is that something that you discovered in your research, or if not, that's okay."
Not really.
Okay. Um, and that's normal for capstone presentations. That there are always going to be some questions that fall outside the scope of what you chose to focus on. Ryan asked, "How often are psychopaths diagnosed? Do you know anything about that? Like, is there a high rate of this?"
No, only 1% of the population are actually psychopaths. And often there are people who are corporate psychopaths where you wouldn't even know that
Mhm.
they actually are.
Okay. There was a question earlier. I lost it, but it said something to the effect of like, why is this happening? Is there any sort of uh, understanding of what causes psychopathy? I mean, other
Often
than the topics that you covered there.
the deficiencies are already in the brain, but it usually takes something to set someone off.
Hmm.
So psychopaths usually, the areas of the brain that control emotion, they're often lesser than a regular person. And like I said, abuse or trauma or even one event in their life can set someone off.
Right. Did you look into the idea of like that genetic predisposition between like psychopaths, well, I guess like violent psychopaths, which you focused on, and functional psychopaths, like if there was a difference there?
A little bit. The one type of psychopath I found was genetic, was schizophrenic psychopaths, but
Hmm.
other than that, it's either a functioning psychopath has a child who is a psychopath, or just normal parents have a child who is a psychopath. There's not
Okay.
much connection.
Uh, did you discover if there was any way to track? So I get, is there any sort of like DNA analysis in psychopathy where you'd be able to sort of track over generations the likelihood of an issue?
I didn't really look into that, but one of the books I used in my research goes into that heavily. Actually, the author researched it about himself and his own
Hmm.
genetics. So,
Do you, if you happen to remember that book, great. If not,
it's right here. It's Murderous Minds.
okay. And do you have the author's name?
It's by Dean A. Haycock.
Okay, thank you. What about, so a question from Ms. Sorial here. Did you find any correlations among children raised in the foster care system with their likelihood to participate in these behaviors?
No, most of the people I researched were raised by their own family.
Okay,
I really didn't find much about the foster care system.
all right. And Mr. Neal asks, is there any current research on early detection and possible prevention of these behaviors?
Not really, because even doctors, you can't call a child a psychopath. You have to either call them a budding psychopath or a child with empathy issues.
Hmm.
So there's not much research. And also, children might not show signs of psychopathy.
Okay. And then Tucker asked, are intelligence and the rate for being a psychopath or being psychopaths related? For example, like the smarter the person is, the more likely they might be a psychopath.
Um, I didn't really find that in my research. Like, yes, David Berkowitz had a very high IQ score, but
Hmm.
his brain was already deteriorating from the schizophrenia, so there was no real correlation between intelligence and psychopathy.
Okay. That I'm looking to see if there are any additional questions, but I think one may pop in. But I'll just say that uh, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. Congratulations, you've completed Capstone, and with it, your high school career. So congratulations for that. And I hope that you have a wonderful college career. And if you choose to continue looking this or researching this, you are very successful in that endeavor. Oh, let me think. I did get one more question here. It's from Dr. Holden. It says, "Great job, Olivia. Your frame for thinking about psychopaths is entirely medical. Is there a place for evil in thinking about such people, or are we just the product of the chemicals in our heads?"
I think we're just a product of the chemical in our heads, but also the media that we're taking in.
All right. So it sounds like, uh, you know, so he's thinking of it more from like almost like a moral standpoint, but you're saying that there
Yeah.
are external factors, but in terms of what's internal, it's going to be more biological in nature or chemical in nature.
Mhm.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, then I'm gonna say that that's it. You are finished with your presentation. Congratulations. Let me just go back and I'll just say to everyone watching, thank you for joining us. We will be meeting back here at let's see, 12:30 for our next presentation, which is going to be Jack Wiley presenting on learning differences. So I hope you'll join us then. Thank you.